I remember that night vividly, even though it wasn't particularly remarkable at first. The air was sharp, early autumn sharp, carrying that smell of wet earth and fallen leaves that always makes the countryside feel alive in a way the city never does. I had decided to take a walk through the back roads near the old farm where I had grown up. The sun had set an hour ago, leaving the sky a deep, ink-black blue with only a few stars visible between thin wisps of clouds. There was no moon that night, and that absence made everything feel heavier, darker, somehow quieter. The road I walked on was narrow, a simple strip of asphalt lined with cornfields and dense patches of forest on either side. I had been walking this path many times during the day, but at night it was different. At night, everything seemed bigger, slower, more deliberate. The trees that were welcoming in the sunlight now looked like looming shapes, their branches twisting against the sky in strange angles. Even the cornfields that swayed gently in the breeze took on a new menace. Their stalks rustled softly, but in the dark it sounded like whispers, like hundreds of tiny voices moving just out of sight. I had a small flashlight with me, just enough to illuminate the path a few feet ahead. I hadn't brought it to see far, mostly just so I wouldn't stumble over the uneven edges of the road or trip on stray rocks and roots. The beam cut through the darkness, sharp and white, revealing the texture of the asphalt, the jagged edges of tire tracks, and the occasional dry leaf blowing across the surface. When I pointed it into the cornfields, the stalks disappeared into darkness so quickly it was like they were swallowing the light. I noticed shadows moving among them, though I couldn't see anything clearly. A rabbit, probably, or maybe the wind, but it made me pause for a moment. The further I walked, the quieter it became. The faint hum of insects that I had heard in the early evening had stopped. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. The wind moved through the fields and the trees, but it was soft, almost hesitant, like it didn't want to announce itself. I was aware of every sound, the distant flap of a crow's wing, the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, the low hum of my own breathing. Each sound seemed amplified in the darkness. After about half an hour, I reached a fork in the road I hadn't noticed before, or at least hadn't paid attention to. One path continued along the edge of the cornfield, the other led into a small forested area. I felt a pull toward the forest, though I couldn't say why. There was nothing particularly inviting about it, but something in the way the trees pressed close together, the way the path seemed to narrow and disappear, made me curious. I moved toward it, flashlight in hand, stepping carefully over roots and loose stones. The forest was denser than I expected, and the road, if it could even be called that, became more like a trail. It was here that the real unease began. Not from anything supernatural, nothing beyond reason, but because everything became unpredictable. The sound of my own steps echoed strangely among the trees, sometimes too close, sometimes delayed, as if the forest was swallowing and returning the noise in irregular patterns. A small animal darted across the path at one point, and I jumped, my heart thudding in my chest. I realized how much more alert I had become. My eyes strained to pick out shapes beyond the reach of my flashlight. Every shadow seemed too large, every movement too fast. I reached a narrow clearing, maybe 20 feet wide, where the trail opened up slightly. Here, I could see the outlines of the surrounding fields and the faint shapes of distant hills. The clearing was eerily still. No insects, no wind, no animals, just silence. I stopped for a moment, breathing slowly to calm myself, noticing how the darkness seemed to press in around me. Even with the flashlight, the edges of the clearing were hazy, like the night itself was folding over the land. I kept walking more cautiously now, aware that I was moving deeper into an area I didn't know well. The trail twisted and turned, and I had to duck under low branches, step over fallen logs, and navigate patches of mud and loose stones. At one point, my foot slipped on a wet patch of leaves, and I nearly fell. The sudden jolt of fear was sharp, enough to make my stomach tighten. I paused, gripping a tree for balance, listening to my own ragged breathing, trying to remind myself that I knew the area. I knew these woods. There was nothing here that could hurt me beyond my own missteps. But the darkness had a way of exaggerating everything. Then I heard it, a low, crunching sound coming from somewhere off the trail, deeper in the trees. My body froze. It wasn't close, not right next to me, but it was deliberate. The slow, steady crunch of feet moving over leaves. I held my flashlight steady, sweeping it slowly from side to side. There was nothing there. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. My pulse was racing, and my mind tried to reason it out. Deer probably, or a fox, or maybe someone else walking a distant path. The rational part of me knew this, but the dark made the rational part quiet. I decided to turn back. It felt like the right choice, to retrace my steps and head toward the familiar stretch of road along the cornfields. The walk back was tense. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the underbrush made me flinch. The flashlight revealed small things I had never noticed before: webs strung between branches, gnawed tree bark, clusters of mushrooms growing in damp soil. Each tiny detail became exaggerated in the silence of the night, as if the forest itself were aware of my presence and shifting subtly in response. When I finally emerged from the forest trail back onto the wider road, relief washed over me. The cornfields on either side seemed less threatening in the open space, less like giant, watchful figures. I walked more steadily now, my shoulders relaxing, letting myself take in the familiar smells: the wet earth, the crisp air, the faint scent of the nearby farmhouse animals. The road stretched ahead in gentle curves, and I could see the faint lights of distant houses through the darkness. As I continued, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: how quiet the countryside had become at night. No cars, no distant music, no human voices. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the earth around me. And yet, for the first time, I wasn't afraid anymore. The tension I had carried through the forest began to fade, replaced by a calm awareness. I realized I had faced my unease, walked through it, and come out the other side without incident. The night wasn't dangerous in the way my mind had imagined. It was just unfamiliar, demanding attention and respect. By the time I reached the small bridge near the edge of the farm, the sky had started to lighten slightly. The first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon, turning the black of night into a deep, soft gray. The air felt fresher, almost like it had been holding its breath while I walked through the darkness. I paused for a moment, leaning on the railing of the bridge, looking at the water flowing quietly beneath. Everything looked different in the early light, ordinary things suddenly holding a subtle beauty I hadn't noticed before. I continued the last stretch of road toward home, my steps lighter, more measured. The fear, the tension, the unease of the night walk had given way to a sense of accomplishment, a quiet confidence in my own ability to navigate the unknown. The houses became more distinct, the lights warmer, and the familiar smells of kitchens and wood smoke greeted me. By the time I reached my driveway, the sun was beginning to rise fully, spilling golden light across the fields. I paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill my lungs. The night had been dark, tense, and filled with small, sharp moments of fear, but it had ended clearly, safely, with nothing worse than my own imagination to contend with. I realized then that the countryside at night was not something to fear but something to respect, a place that demanded awareness, patience, and calm. Walking through it had reminded me of the quiet strength that comes from facing small, real fears and seeing them through to the end. I went inside, removed my boots, and felt a lingering thrill from the walk, a quiet satisfaction. The night had been scary in its own way, but the ending had been clear, calm, and real. I had walked through the darkness and returned with a new sense of ease, a quiet understanding of the land, the night, and myself. I was riding my motorcycle through the back roads of rural Vermont on a late September afternoon, the kind of day where the sunlight drifts low over the hills and the air carries a sharp chill. The colors of the trees were shifting, early hints of fall creeping into the green, turning the landscape into streaks of gold and red. I didn't have a plan except to follow whatever roads seemed interesting. I'd always liked exploring alone, the way the silence of the countryside seems to stretch on forever, the wind and the engine being the only things that fill the space. I left the main highway behind sometime in the early afternoon, turning onto a narrow, cracked asphalt road that was barely more than a strip between the trees. The road climbed and twisted between low hills, small streams crossing under weathered culverts. The air smelled like wet leaves and dirt, and the faint fog rolling over the hills made the world feel damp and heavy. At first, it was calming. I slowed when I approached corners, leaning into the curves and feeling the tires grip the road, enjoying the way the motorcycle responded to the turns. After a while, I realized I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No houses, no barns, no farms, nothing but the forest pressing close on either side of the road. I felt a little unease creeping in, that subtle nervous edge that comes when the world feels a little too empty. The road dipped down alongside a small creek, its banks lined with tall grass and clusters of maple and birch. The sound of the water was faint but steady, and for a moment, I let myself enjoy the peace. thinking about how quiet it was, how untouched. Then I noticed something odd. Tire tracks in the dirt along a stretch of shoulder that seemed too rough for a car. They were fresh, or at least looked like someone had passed recently. The problem was that the road ahead suddenly felt unfamiliar. I slowed and tried to remember the last stretch I had passed. Nothing looked the same. The trees, the bends, the little offshoots that usually help me orient myself, it all felt wrong. I even pulled out my GPS to check my location. It was glitching badly, flickering between two spots, jumping ahead, and then back like it couldn't decide where I was. That made me pause, which was rare for me on a road I knew could be empty. I kept riding cautiously, scanning for anything familiar, and that's when I saw it. Up ahead, at a fork in the road, there was a figure standing still. They held a flashlight that cut a narrow beam through the fog, pointing down at the ground but swaying slightly, as if they were moving their wrist. I slowed even more, my heart kicking up because I didn't expect anyone here. I tried to make out if it was a worker or someone hiking, anything ordinary, but the fog thickened in that exact spot. By the time I was close enough to get a clear look, the figure was gone. Not walking away, not hiding, it just wasn't there. I scanned the area for footprints or signs, something to explain it, but there were none. The dirt was soft from recent rain, and nothing disturbed it. Even the flashlight was gone, as if it had never been there. Panic started to settle in then. The calm, quiet ride I had been enjoying vanished, replaced by that raw, tight feeling in the chest you get when you're suddenly very aware that you're alone and things don't make sense. My first instinct was to turn around and head back the way I came. I kicked the engine, the sound loud in the fog, and leaned into the turns. But the fog was thick now, rolling in from the hills and across the creek, filling the road and distorting everything. Curves that I should have recognized looked unfamiliar. Rocks, roots, the faint outline of the creek, nothing matched what I remembered. I slowed, tried to keep calm, but the fear was real and heavy, pressing down like the mist itself. The more I rode, the more disoriented I became. Every bend seemed to loop back on itself. I could see a few hundred feet ahead at best, the fog breaking the road into small, disconnected patches of light and shadow. My senses were on high alert. I imagined things moving just outside the edge of vision, branches snapping, leaves rustling. The tracks I had seen earlier weren't visible anymore. I couldn't tell if I had missed them or if they had disappeared, and I hated that uncertainty. My hands were gripping the handlebars too tightly, knuckles white, and my breath came in short bursts through my helmet. I finally spotted something familiar far ahead, a small sign, rusted, leaning at an angle. It was a marker I had passed earlier, on one of the roads I'd been exploring before I got lost. Relief hit me, sharp and almost physical. I followed the faint outline of the sign through the fog, taking it slowly, breaking early around each curve. Eventually, the forest began to thin, and the fog lifted slightly. I realized I was approaching a main road. The cracks and curves of the back road were behind me now, replaced by wider asphalt, clearly maintained, with the smell of tar and gasoline replacing the damp forest scent. I stopped at a gas station at the edge of town, the kind that looks like it hasn't been renovated in decades. I parked, taking the helmet off slowly, trying to calm myself. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the keys. I leaned against the bike for a long time, just staring at the pumps, feeling every muscle in my body relax gradually. The world suddenly seemed more ordinary. The hum of the refrigerators, the distant sound of traffic, the faint smell of coffee. Everything normal in contrast to the strange, impossible stretch of road I had just come from. Even after I left the gas station, I kept thinking about that road. I tried to make sense of it, maybe a seasonal washout, maybe an old logging trail that was partially paved. But it didn't explain the figure, and it didn't explain how the road ahead looked entirely unfamiliar, with curves and bends that didn't exist on any map. By the time I reached home, night had fallen completely. The ride back along familiar highways felt easy, almost comforting, but I couldn't shake the memory of that fork in the road, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist, and the thick silence that seemed to swallow everything. In the end, I told myself it was probably just a stretch of road that wasn't marked on maps anymore. Maybe someone had been there earlier, left tracks, and disappeared into the forest. The important part was that I was safe, and I had found my way back. Still, every time I think about Vermont's backroads, I remember that fog, the figure, and how quickly the ordinary world can feel entirely unreal when you're alone and disoriented. It's a story I replay in my mind, a reminder to respect the quiet places that seem empty, because emptiness can trick you in ways you never expect. I set out that morning thinking it would be just another long walk, nothing more. The air was crisp, early November in Pennsylvania, with the kind of chill that makes you pull your jacket tighter but also keeps you awake. The trail started off simple enough, running alongside a shallow creek that trickled quietly, leaves floating on its surface. Most of the trees had already lost their leaves, leaving the ground carpeted in yellows, browns, and dull reds, making a soft rustling sound under my boots with every step. The sky was pale gray, overcast, but the light was still enough to see clearly. I had packed a small bag with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and a few essentials. I had thought about leaving early, but the morning had gotten away from me, and I had only started hiking mid-morning. I figured a few hours wouldn't be a problem. The trail quickly narrowed as it entered a stretch of dense woods. Trees leaned close together, their bare branches weaving overhead to form a thin, uneven canopy that dimmed the light. The smell changed as well. The air was damp, the scent of wet soil and decaying leaves strong and earthy. I felt the crunch of leaves and small sticks beneath my feet, and the occasional snap of a twig from some unseen animal. Birds had mostly disappeared, and the quiet pressed in around me, the kind of quiet that feels almost physical when you're alone. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until I could hear only my own breathing and the rhythm of my footsteps. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of fields in the distance, small patches of farmland surrounded by tree lines, the occasional red barn or white farmhouse standing out against the muted autumn colors. But these clearings were few and far between, and I quickly lost track of how far I had walked. I had been hiking for several hours when I realized the sun was dropping faster than I expected. Shadows grew long and strange, stretching across the trail, and the gray sky dimmed into a sort of flat, heavy darkness. I paused and tried to estimate how much daylight I had left. Not much. I didn't have a map, and I hadn't really studied this trail before, relying instead on memory from a few online descriptions. I should have planned better. My pace quickened, a low nervous energy creeping into my movements as the daylight faded. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of the dimming light, but as I crested a small rise, I saw a cabin nestled between two low hills, almost hidden by the trees. Smoke rose lazily from its chimney, curling into the gray sky. The windows glowed warmly, like someone had a fire going inside. Relief washed over me at the thought of warmth and light, the idea of a safe spot to rest and regroup. The trail had narrowed so much that the cabin seemed both close and unreachable, tucked deep into the clearing. I slowed down as I approached, taking in the quiet again. The woods around the cabin were utterly still. No wind, no rustling animals, nothing but the occasional drip of water from the trees. The smoke smelled faintly of burning wood, clean and dry, the kind of smell that makes you think of winter evenings and warmth. But still, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The air felt heavier near the cabin, like stepping into a pocket of the forest where time had slowed. I drew closer, my boots making soft impressions in the soft soil and leaf litter. The clearing widened just enough for me to see the full cabin. It was small, modest, made of dark wood that had weathered over time. No porch, no signs of recent life outside, no path leading to it, no car or truck parked anywhere. The glow from inside was steady, warm, and inviting, but my gut tightened as I noticed the figure at the window. A person stood there, completely still, staring directly at me. I froze, my brain scrambling for the right response. At first, I thought maybe it was someone who had been expecting visitors, maybe a neighbor, maybe even a hunter's cabin, but there was no movement at all. They didn't wave, didn't turn, didn't do anything except stand and stare. The figure was vague, but human, I was certain, and it unnerved me more than I wanted to admit. I thought about knocking or calling out, but my voice faltered. My chest tightened, and every instinct in my body screamed to leave. The figure made no sound, and the warm light suddenly felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The glow disappeared, and the window turned into a black void. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Silence swallowed the clearing entirely. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what I had just seen, or what I should do next. I debated whether to move slowly back toward the trail, or turn and run. My body finally chose for me. I stepped back into the darkness of the forest, keeping my eyes forward, but hearing every tiny sound behind me. The first crunch of twigs snapped me fully awake. Someone or something was behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs carried me forward without thought, my heart hammering in my chest. Branches scratched at my jacket and face as I ran through the narrowing trail, the the dim light of dusk fading into almost complete darkness. Every step I took felt too loud, too exposed. The wind had picked up slightly, and it carried the faint scent of smoke, or maybe it was just my mind replaying what I had seen. Twigs snapped again behind me, closer this time, and I forced myself to keep moving. The trail curved, twisted, and I stumbled over roots I couldn't see, my hands scraping against rough bark as I caught myself. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and ragged, and my pulse in my ears. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before I finally saw a faint line of moonlight breaking through the trees, the trail opening up into a wider path. I forced myself to slow slightly, though not too much, and kept moving toward the sound of distant cars, the faint hum of civilization that I knew would lead me back to my car. I didn't stop until the forest thinned, until I could see the main trail again, worn and familiar. Relief washed over me, but my chest ached, my legs burned, and my mind refused to let go of the image of that window, of that figure standing completely still in the dim light. I stayed alert as I followed the main trail back, making sure to keep moving until the last trees cleared, and I could see the edge of the road where I had parked my car hours ago. The parking area was empty, the dirt and gravel cold and silent, but it felt safe compared to the woods I had just left. I slowed, my hands shaking as I unlocked the car and slid inside, grateful for the warmth of the engine and the artificial glow of the interior lights. I stayed there for several minutes, taking deep breaths, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of trick of the fading light or my imagination. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been. Something had been in that cabin. Someone. And I had no idea why or what they had been doing. I finally started the car and drove slowly down the road, eyes darting to every shadow along the roadside. Nothing followed. Nothing emerged. Eventually, I reached the main highway and the familiar stretch that would take me back home. I passed farms and small houses again, ordinary and unthreatening in the clear light of early evening street lamps. My body gradually relaxed, though the memory of the cabin and the figure stayed with me, vivid and unsettling. I didn't take that trail again. I made sure to stick to marked paths, to plan my hikes better, and to never let the sun get so low without a clear exit. Even weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The cabin was just out there, somewhere, hidden between two hills, in a stretch of woods that otherwise seemed ordinary and peaceful. And I knew that while I had escaped that evening, not everyone might be so lucky. It was a sharp reminder that the countryside can be quiet and beautiful, but it can also hide people and situations that feel completely wrong, and that sometimes instincts are the only warning you get. I never saw another building on that trail, never another figure, and yet I still think about that still window every time I walk through a forested path alone. I spent that summer at my uncle's farm in a small, remote part of West Virginia. It was the kind of place where the roads were mostly gravel, the houses were far apart, and the forests pressed in close around every cleared field. My uncle's property stretched for several dozen acres, a mix of open pastures, rough woodlands, and overgrown trails that I was allowed to wander during the day. I had been there for a few weeks, helping out with small chores and enjoying the quiet that I couldn't get in the city. I was used to the sounds of the countryside, the distant hum of cicadas, the occasional crow, the soft lowing of cows. But at night, the quiet seemed heavier, almost solid. That night, I decided to take a walk around the property, just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The air was cool for summer, a faint breeze moving through the tall grass and the trees lining the old pasture. Shadows stretched long across the fields, and the last rays of sunlight made everything look orange and dark at the same time. I started at the back of the house and wandered toward the old pasture, which had been empty for months. The pasture gate had been broken for as long as I could remember. It hung on one hinge and had swung freely when anyone tried to push it open or shut. But that evening, as I approached, I noticed the gate was closed and latched, the metal catching the dim light of the setting sun. That struck me as odd because I could have sworn I left it open earlier in the day when I had walked past. I reached out slowly to touch it, half expecting it to swing open with a push, but it didn't budge. The latch had a solid click to it. I paused for a moment, listening to the quiet around me. The pasture stretched far beyond the gate, a rough field that used to hold my uncle's cows, now overgrown with tall weeds and wild grass. It was quiet in a way that made every small sound seem louder. I thought I heard something then, a faint shuffling from the far end of the field, where the grass was thicker and the trees began. I stopped walking, straining to see, my eyes adjusting to the darkness that was settling fast. That's when I saw it, a figure, hunched and moving strangely across the field. At first, I couldn't make out what it was carrying, only that it seemed to be dragging something along the ground. The way it moved was jerky, deliberate, as if it was trying to keep it hidden from view. I froze, my stomach tightening. The figure paused for a second, then bent again, moving in short, stiff steps. My uncle had warned me about wandering at night, about hunters who sometimes came through or people who trespassed on the property, but there was a different feeling about this. The figure didn't move like someone who was hunting, like a person looking for deer or game. It was slower, careful, unnatural. I could just barely make out the outline against the field, but not a single detail of its face or clothing. I wanted to call out, to yell or run, but my voice felt trapped in my chest. Then it straightened up suddenly and turned its head in my direction. For a second, I felt certain it had seen me, even though I couldn't see a face, just the vague shape of a head turning. My heart started hammering in my chest. The quiet of the countryside suddenly felt dangerous, as if it had shifted from calm to watching. I didn't wait to see more. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, running back toward the house as fast as I could through the uneven ground of the yard. The grass snagged at my shoes, the uneven dirt making my footing uncertain, but I kept going. My chest burned, my lungs screamed, and every step I took felt loud, echoing in the empty air. When I reached the house, I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. I pressed my back against the door for a long moment, listening to the night around me. The wind rustled through the trees, and I thought I could hear faint steps moving in the grass outside, but I wasn't sure. My uncle came home late that night, and I told him what I saw. He didn't seem surprised, only serious. He explained quietly that sometimes people came through the property, not looking for anything simple like cows, but for other, darker purposes. I didn't ask what he meant exactly, and he didn't say more. I didn't need him to. That was enough to make me decide that field was off limits at night. The next few nights, I avoided walking anywhere near the pasture after dark. During the day, the field looked peaceful again, just tall grass swaying in the breeze, the remnants of old fences and posts sticking up here and there. But at night, I could still picture that hunched figure, dragging whatever it was across the field, moving in a strange, unnatural way. The memory of it stayed with me, a heavy weight in the quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment it had looked toward me, it had known exactly where I was. Weeks later, when it was time to leave my uncle's farm, I walked through the property one last time in the daylight. Everything seemed calm, familiar. The pasture gate was broken again, leaning slightly on its hinge, as if it had never been latched. There were no signs of anyone having been there, no tracks in the grass, nothing that would explain what I had seen. I realized then that it didn't matter. The memory of that night was enough to make me cautious forever. I knew there were people who moved quietly through the countryside at night, people who came looking for things that weren't theirs. I never returned to that pasture after dark, and I made a habit of staying close to the house or walking well-lit paths when I was on rural properties after that. The lesson stayed with me. The countryside, even the quiet, beautiful parts, wasn't always safe after dark. The open fields and the dark woods could hide anyone, and the silence that felt so peaceful during the day could feel threatening at night. Even years later, I can still remember that night vividly. The way the figure moved, the way it stopped and turned its head, the heavy quiet that made my heart pound like a drum. I never doubted that what I saw was real, and I never walked past that field after sunset again. I left the farm knowing that some dangers in the countryside didn't make a sound, didn't announce themselves, but were just there, waiting in the dark. And sometimes, that was enough to make a place that seemed safe during the day feel completely unsafe once the sun went down. I remember that summer night in Kentucky like it was yesterday, even though I've tried to push it from my mind more times than I can count. I had been at a friend's place a few counties over, the kind of place where the roads are barely more than two-lane blacktop, and the trees and fields press close on either side. It was late, maybe just past 10, and the sun had fully set hours before, leaving only the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. The air smelled of warm earth and cut grass, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes in rural areas after a long day. I was tired from the drive and the heat, but the road back to my house was supposed to be easy. Straight stretches, familiar turns, nothing I hadn't driven 100 times. Or so I thought. The road I took runs through miles of farmland. Cornfields stretch endlessly on both sides, the stalks tall and thick in the summer, bending slightly with the wind. That night, the wind was gentle but steady, brushing across the tops of the plants, and it made a soft rustling sound that I could hear even over the hum of the tires on asphalt. There were no streetlights, just the faint shine of my headlights cutting through the night, illuminating patches of the field now and then. At one point, a lone tree would break the flat horizon, casting a long, thin shadow across the road. I always liked that drive during the day, the way the landscape rolled gently and the air was open, but at night it felt different. The darkness felt heavy, almost solid, and every rustle of the corn seemed closer than it should. I had been driving for about 20 minutes when I saw him. At first, I thought it was someone walking along the side of the road, but as I got closer, I realized he was standing right in the middle of the asphalt. He was completely still, holding something in his hands. My first instinct was to slow down, my foot easing off the gas without me even thinking. The headlights caught his figure, and I could see that he was wearing clothes that were dirty, old, and torn in places, as if they had been worn for days without washing. His posture was rigid, almost stiff, and he didn't flinch or move as I drove closer. I rolled my window down, mostly to see if he needed help. Maybe someone had broken down out here, I thought. But the second I looked closer, I noticed his face. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Sunken pale, with lines that didn't match his apparent age. His eyes were hollow, empty in a way that made my stomach drop. He lifted his head slowly, just enough for me to see the shape of his face clearly. I couldn't understand what he said. It was a whisper, low and garbled, more like a sound than words. My body tensed. Something in me screamed that I shouldn't be here, that I should leave immediately. I had driven past sketchy situations before, but this felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I pressed the gas pedal lightly, trying to move past him. But then he stepped into my path. It wasn't a slow move or a wave, it was sudden and deliberate. My heart jumped into my throat. I swerved sharply to avoid him, the tires screeching as they dug into the loose gravel at the edge of the road. The car tilted dangerously, one wheel threatening to drop into the shallow ditch that ran alongside the asphalt. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, and I forced myself to regain control. When I looked back into the rearview mirror, the man was gone. My chest was pounding, sweat starting to form on my forehead despite the warm summer air. I thought for a moment that maybe he had run off into the cornfields, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I slowed down slightly, I saw it. The corn near the road was flattened in a rough semicircle, broken stalks bent and torn, as if someone had been struggling there. There was no path leading into it, no footprints I could make out, just the disturbed, trampled stalks forming a sort of shallow depression in the earth. It didn't make sense. Cornfields aren't easy to move through silently or quickly, and the way it was flattened made it clear that whatever had happened, it hadn't been ordinary. I didn't stop. I didn't even breathe. I just kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel as if letting go would somehow make everything collapse around me. The wind rustled the remaining stalks, but the sound was different now, tense, almost like it was holding its breath. I kept glancing into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there again, watching me as I drove. The rest of the drive was a blur. Every shadow seemed like a person. Every bend in the road felt like a trap. I drove faster than I should have, adrenaline keeping me awake and tense, until I finally reached the small lights of my neighborhood. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I killed the engine and sat there for a long time, staring out at the darkness beyond the porch light, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it was some drifter or a prank gone wrong. I didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. I kept replaying it in my head, over and over, each time noticing more details I hadn't before. The smell of the corn, the way the man held whatever he was carrying, the way his eyes looked like they had seen something no one should ever see. I told myself it was probably someone messed up on something, wandering the fields late at night, maybe even homeless. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. How could he appear and vanish so fast? How could someone move through a cornfield so quietly and leave behind such a pattern without leaving any other sign? I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I started driving that road again during the day, taking in the familiar scenery and trying to normalize it. Everything seemed ordinary, the same cornfields, the same bends in the road. But I never went near that crossroad after dark. I found alternative routes home when I could, even if they added miles. The memory of that night stuck with me, quiet but sharp, like a thin blade pressed against the back of my mind. I realized that some encounters don't have explanations, and some moments in life aren't meant to be understood. Years later, I still remember the smell of the corn that night, the wind brushing over the fields, and the hollow stare of the man. I know the world isn't always safe, even in quiet rural places where you think nothing could go wrong. The road is just a road, the fields are just fields, but there are moments when the ordinary bends into something else, something you can't ignore. Now, I tell people to be careful on back roads at night, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because you never know what kind of real danger could be standing there waiting, silent, and watching. I learned that night that sometimes, getting home safely isn't about speed or skill. It's about listening to your instincts and knowing when to leave fast, without hesitation. I still avoid that stretch of road. Even driving by during the day, I feel a tightness in my chest when I see that crossroad, the flattened cornfield, and I remind myself that night exists for a reason, that some things are best left alone. The fear isn't loud anymore, but it's steady, a quiet hum under every memory of rural roads at night. It's a memory that taught me caution, respect, and the unnerving truth that not all dangers announce themselves. They just wait, patient, in the dark.